Good afternoon, all. My name is Len Gordon. I'm the chair of the Advertising and Marketing Group here at Venable. I spend a good amount of my time defending individuals and companies in FTC investigations, frequently involving health products. I'm fortunate to be joined by two of my colleagues today, Claudia Lewis and Richard Starr, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Thank you, Len. Also very nice to be here this afternoon. I'm Claudia Lewis. I'm co-chair of the FDA group here at Venable, based in Washington, D.C. And like Len, and with Len actually, I spend a good amount of my time not only focused on FDA regulations, but where FTC challenges FDA regulated products, I connect with and work with partners like Len to defend them before the Federal Trade Commission.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Starr. I'm an associate in Venable's FDA group. I work very closely with Claudia and Len on a number of FDA and FTC issues, and it's a pleasure to be here, and we hope to have a great webinar.
Thanks. Can we get the next slide, please? So this is just a brief outline of what we'll cover today. We'll talk about some FTC basics. We'll talk about the 1998 dietary supplement guidance that the FTC had promulgated, and then talk about the 2022 guidance issued at the end of last year and the key changes in the FTC's approach in that guidance. We'll talk to you a little bit about how the FTC's change in approach impacts other regulatory activities and highlight the amount of other regulatory activity. And then we really hope to save some time at the end for questions, and we will do our best to answer your questions, at least as many of them as we can. But I think we'll try and do that at the end just for the sake of time to make sure we get through everything. So can I get the next slide, please? Thanks. So financial principles of advertising. The new FTC guidance document starts where the FTC usually starts, with some FTC basics. Probably good to start there for us as well, so that everybody's level set. So the FTC uses sections 5 and sections 12 of the FTC Act as interpreted through the policy statement on deception and advertising substantiation standards to challenge false and deceptive advertising of all types. Today we're going to be talking about health products. The FTC issues policy statements and guidance for specific industries and advertising practices. These are not regulations, but they do represent the FTC's view of certain practices, and I'll talk in a little bit more detail in a minute about why that might be important. The 1998 dietary supplement guidance was really important for the dietary supplement industry, tried to set rules of the FTC's road, not necessarily force of law, but at least how the FTC viewed it. And now they've issued the 2022 health products compliance guidance, and here guidance is not just limited to dietary supplements, but all products affecting health, which is obviously a very significant increase in the scope of the guidance. And I think it probably reflects some of what we see going on in the marketplace, where more and more products are making health claims, and the FTC is cognizant of that. If you think about the big health cases that the FTC has brought in the last couple of years, the biggest was probably the Palm Wonderful case, and that was not a dietary supplement case. That was a juice case that was making health claims. So I think the expansion of the guidance probably tracks the ever-broadening nature of products that make health claims. The purpose, at least according to the FTC, of the guidance is to sort of set the rules of the road for health claims. So I'm hoping you guys all know this, but we'll remind you just in case. Advertisements need to be truthful and not misleading. The truthful part's probably easier than the misleading part. And they must be substantiated before disseminating an ad. Advertisers must have evidence to back up their claims. The FTC's view, as a general rule, is that claims about health benefits of foods, dietary supplements, drugs, products, devices require substantiation in the form of competent and reliable scientific evidence. And we'll talk in some detail in a bit about what that means. The FTC takes a broad view of who is responsible for the potentially deceptive claims. So advertising agencies. In certain instances, spokespeople or endorsers, affiliate marketers, lead generators. The FTC takes a very broad view, and I would say that the more they dislike the conduct, and the broader a net they may cast. They've gone after payment processors, including payment processors who were processing for companies selling nutraceuticals, because they thought that the products were of such dubious value that the processors had to know that consumers were being scammed frequently and being enrolled in negative option continuity programs, and so even going after payment processors. So someone fairly far removed from the substantiation for a claim. So the FTC has a broad toolbox, a big toolbox. It's changed a little bit. Almost 2 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the FTC could no longer seek equitable monetary relief under Section 13D of the FTC Act, because that was beyond what the statute on its face authorized. And that had been how the FTC challenged and seek to recover money for consumers, primarily in health and dietary supplement claims. So what did the FTC do in response? Well, they did a couple things. First, they tried to get Congress to fix that hole in the remedial authority, and that has been unsuccessful thus far. But the FTC got resourceful. They looked at some other statutes that they have broader remedial authority than Section 5, the general statute, or Section 12 of the FTC Act. So they started looking at things like the COVID Consumer Protection Act, which authorizes either civil penalties or consumer redress. They started broadening the number of products that were covered by the Opioid Addiction Act. They started using the Restore Online Shoppers Confidence Act, which is a statute that we typically think of for either passing data from one seller to another or dealing with negative option selling. But the FTC started taking a broader view of that, and any claims that were made in connection with that potential offering arguably fall within ROSCA. ROSCA authorizes civil penalties for consumer redress, so they started broadening the scope of ROSCA cases, and they also started relying a little bit more heavily on the telemarketing sales rule. Finally, the FTC has been partnering with states to piggyback on the state's remedial authority, where the FTC might not have the ability to get equitable monetary relief. They're using state resources, state remedial schemes to get what the FTC could not get directly. The next slide, please. So, quick note on claims and substantiation. So, what's the law for substantiation? The FTC has built up a body of case law that substantiation is required for any objective provable claim, express or implied, made about a product or service in the ad. So that's efficacy, quality, comparative claims. Again, it's the advertiser's burden to prove that they have substantiation. It's not the FTC's burden to prove that it's not. And I think at times that raises First Amendment concerns. When I was at the FTC, I was on one side of those. Now I'm back in private practice, I'm on the other side. But there's certainly concerns that if the FTC is imposing too draconian substantiation standards a fortiori before the claim is made, that could chill legitimate commercial speech. And I suspect Claudia agrees that some of the guidance here is that when the rubber starts to hit the road, you will see some First Amendment issues arise.
For sure.
It's important to remember that when an ad lends itself to more than one reasonable interpretation, there must be substantiation for each interpretation. Saying, well, I didn't mean to make that claim, it doesn't mean that the FTC is not going to require you to substantiate that claim. And if you're relying on studies or you're relying on empirical evidence, in a lot of instances, it may be necessary to disclose, at least in some circumstances, what the basis for that empirical claim is. And for good housekeeping and good prophylaxis to make sure you don't end up on the wrong side of an FTC case, you got to keep it. You can't just look at it one time and then, make the claim and then not worry about it. You've got to keep your substantiation file current, and you need to stay current on the science involving your products, because as the science changes, what claims are within the safe zone could change. So let me turn it over to Claudia to talk a little bit about the FDA as opposed to the FTC.
Thank you, Lynn. And one of the reasons why we have this slide and why we're presenting together with the FTC team is not only do we work together a lot of our clients do have questions about, what is FDA's role versus FTC's role? And do I have safe harbor or coverage under FDA rules vis-a-vis the FTC? And I think the answer in large part is yes, but not always. And the FDA's primary responsibility is for claims on labels and labeling. So what's actually affixed to the labels and what you might put on your websites and social media and things like that. Whereas FTC has responsibility for all forms of advertising, which goes beyond just what's on product labeling as well. The other thing that I would say is that FDA is very focused on, which category of product your product, which classification your product fits within. Are you a food? Are you a dietary supplement? Are you a drug? Are you a cosmetic? All those different categories have different regulatory requirements under FDA regulations. And it's really about the turn of phrase and the language that you're using in connection with those products. And a term of art is the intended use of the product. And so if the intended use is that of a supplement or a food for nourishment, for fortifying the body, then the FDA is going to say, okay, you don't need certain regulatory oversight. But if you're supposed to be a product that's diagnostic in form, or if you're supposed to be treatment informed, then the FDA has a different classification and there's more oversight for those types of products. FTC does not distinguish between the types of health products or claims. The FTC's sole focus is on whether they're truthful and not misleading. And so that's one big distinction. And so whereas FDA might not ask you, and Lynn mentioned this about COVID, whether your immune claim in connection with vitamin C is truthful or not, the FTC is very interested in that. And FTC does not distinguish between structure function claims or other kinds of claims. Again, just really focused on whether there's evidence and supports. And I think that Lynn touched on the types of evidence that's necessary, and we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail later. So FTC does distinguish from if there's a health claim that FDA has approved through the significant scientific standard, which is to be distinguished between the qualified health claim standard. The FTC does give full deference to the FDA in those instances, where the FTC will give more weight to a claim that meets the qualified health claim standard, where the FDA said that there's some evidence, but not tantamount to the full scientific substantiation standard, then the FTC still has and does. And Lynn and I worked on a case where this was the case, where FTC was like, we know that the FDA says you can use a qualifier for some of this language, but we don't necessarily know that, this is, sort of gets around whether this is truthful and non-misleading. And so I think that as you'll hear today, and what the guidance sort of bears out, is that the FTC and the FDA are not always in total alignment as to whether the substantiation is good enough to communicate to the public about a claim or health benefit. Next slide, please.
So,
Richard is going to do give us some basics about the 1998 guidance document.
yeah, thank you, Claudia.
Mhm.
And we're going to start this deep dive into the 2022 guidance with a bit of a look back to the 98 guidance, as it really informs where we are today. And in 1998, the guidance for dietary supplements, an advertising guide for industry, was really set out to provide some of FTC's expectations surrounding what it means to identify claims when disclosures and qualifications may be needed, how claims can be substantiated and what kind of evidence is required. This was put out in part because DSHEA had just been put out in 4 years earlier than that, and there were a number, the guidance even talks about how there were a number of dietary supplements being marketed, and all of a sudden maybe some clarity was needed as to how to approach some of these claims from an industry and a regulatory perspective. Now, at the time, the guidance really sought to allow for some sufficient flexibility in achieving substantiation, including by considering varying types of evidence, including in vitro and animal studies. And it really has been a useful tool in understanding what kind of substantiation is needed overall, from claims like scientists now agree to determining whether a study is high quality and on point enough to support a given claim. It has certainly informed the status quo of claim substantiation for dietary supplements for the last 25 years or so. And we'll certainly discuss later on about how many of these other claims have evolved into the 2022 guidance. But for now, we have an example just of how the guidance covered disclosures specifically. So here the FTC in the 98 guidance is providing an example where a supplement marketer claims lose 5 pounds in 10 days. The existing disclosure states that a restricted calorie diet and regular exercise is required, but because of the nature of this claim, FTC views it as giving the impression that the use of the product alone will cause the weight loss, and so advises that the claim be revised to avoid any implication that the weight loss can be achieved by the use of the product by itself. And plus, of course, this claim would need to be substantiated. And so the 98 guidance also makes clear up top here that FTC wanted these disclosures to be clear and prominent, not buried in a body of text or in a way that could be easily missed on a website, because those did still exist in 1998. But FTC also highlighted that consumers are likely to be deceived by inconsistent or contradictory information, and so those disclosures need to be direct and unambiguous. And so, as mentioned, the 98 guidance covered a number of other topics, including a few more that Claudia is going to cover here. So I'll turn it over to her.
Absolutely. So it wouldn't be a good seminar and touching on First Amendment issues, as Lynn mentioned, if we didn't talk about traditional use claims. We all know that the dietary supplement industry and a lot of the food industry relies on, historical use of the products and ingredients, and want to sort of disseminate information in connection with those traditional uses. And FTC in 1998 seemed to be a little bit more flexible in terms of how those claims could be communicated. And now what we're seeing is sort of a stronger or more robust standard in connection with those. Consumer testimonials and expert endorsements, I think that the FTC has been very consistent over the years with those types of claims. I think that where we're seeing growth here is because the advent of social media was so nascent in 1998 that, it was time for FTC to sort of update. Third-party literature is another area where I think that the industry, especially in the FDA-regulated column, has, taking some license, if you will. And I think that the FTC has noticed. I think that many of you in the industry are very familiar with the 2-click rule that the FTC mentions in its guidance document, and dispels a lot of myths where the FDA has been silent or very quiet about it. And then we get to the DSHEA disclaimer, which was very important in 1998. As Richard mentioned, DSHEA had just passed. I was newly out of law school at that time. And I remember how much controversy the DSHEA disclaimer created. And now it just seems as almost, a sentence we use in passing and is not much attention paid to it. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, we have our traditional use claims. They're just rooted in history and traditional use. And so FTC is seeing that, these types of claims, depending on the context and what you're saying, might need to be confirmed by, credible scientific evidence or, good scientific evidence. And so that they have to be clearly presented in a way that consumers can understand that the sole basis for these types of claims is the history of use of the particular product. So what we have here as an example is that there is a fork lower remedy used for to aid in digestion that was used for years by Native Americans. And so here the statement about traditional use is accurate. And it seems like the product, the FTC is accepting that the product is consistent with how it was traditionally used. However, if the context in the ad, and now if we add something with social media, suggests that there's some scientific evidence to support that the product aids in digestion, the FTC is demanding that there be a disclosure in connection with that. Okay. Then we have consumer testimonials, which we all know and love and use and frequently are part of the marketing. In 1998, the overall principle was that the advertiser should not make claims to their consumers that they couldn't otherwise substantiate themselves if they made the products directly. One of the examples the FTC used was a best-selling book about the benefits of supplement products that includes a footnote mentioning the most effective brand of the supplement name. The manufacturer of the brand cited in the book has an exclusive promotional agreement with the author and has paid him to reference the product name. And so the FTC would take this particular scenario in 1998 as being deceptive, since it suggests a neutral endorsement when in fact it's the paid endorsement. And this, in the FTC's mind, could only be cured by a fulsome disclosure that there is a financial relationship between the book's author and the product's manufacturer. And I just want to pause on this for a moment because we are focusing on FTC's thoughts about this, but I would want to make sure that people are clear that this also raises the FDA issue. And so this is where the rubber meets the road that Lynn mentioned earlier as to whether this creates a scenario where FDA would question whether the supplement is a drug versus a dietary supplement. And so if the book is talking about heart disease or arthritis and mentions the brand name, then the FDA could be curious about the true status of the product. This is third-party literature. And it's true, and I think that Lynn has talked about it, and I've touched on it, that FTC does not regulate the content or accuracy of statements made by, independent authors, written and published books or articles or other non-commercial literature. But it does prohibit the use of such materials where they're deceptive or could be deceptive when those materials are used in marketing such products. And the determination of whether the materials will be subject to FTC jurisdiction turns largely on whether the materials have been created or being used by an advertiser for the specific purpose of promoting his article or his product. And so one example that the FTC gives is an author publishes a book on the curative properties of herbs. We all have, chicken soup in on our bookshelves and other types of articles now that talks about, how foods and other types of products can be really beneficial to our health. In this scenario, the book is titled The Miracle Cancer Cure, which is always very inviting. And in this scenario, the book does not endorse or otherwise mention a particular supplement brand. And the author doesn't sell any herbal supplements. And so this scenario is non-commercial speech and should be given full First Amendment protections. However, if the marketer of a herb referred to the book through social media or links or referencing the books on its marketing, then the references by the herbal manufacturer would be considered marketing and could be subject to FTC's jurisdiction. And therefore, the advertiser would be responsible for substantiating any claims that are made in connection with by the references to the book. And so it could be portions of the book, or if the book in its entirety was used as part of promoting the product, the entire book could be considered advertising for the purposes of the herbal manufacturer, and they would have to have substantiation for many of the claims in the book as well. Lynn, I see you
Claudia, can I just chime in here?
Mm-hmm.
So this issue is getting more and more complex because it's easier and easier to publish. And the internet is a wonderful thing, but between podcasts, websites that are bifurcated, there's supposedly a content portion where someone might publish content on health issues, public policy issues, all types of things. And then there's a separate website, and hopefully it's separate, that sells products. But if you can link from the content pages to the product pages, it makes it easier for the government to allege that the content pages are commercial speech, do less deference. So, and it's an issue that we have clients who wrestle with this daily, but because it's, when you had to publish a hardcover book, it's a little bit, the distinction's a little cleaner, but because the internet allows you to jump from one thing to another so easily and hot link things, and somebody could take the link to your editorial post and a link to your product and put them together in a social media post. So it's gotten harder, I think, to keep those lines clear, which makes, you really need to be careful as you're thinking about things, and, saying, well, I'm just exercising my First Amendment right to say what I think about certain things. God bless you, but you really need to be careful that you're not linking it to the sale of products.
And so, Lynn, I think this is a good point, and thank you for chiming in with that. And I think that while we're focused on the FTC's perspective, I think is very important. And this is, goes into the 2-click rule, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and the FTC does squarely address, is that this is not only an FTC issue, this is an FDA issue. When you're talking about a cancer cure and you're linking it to your product, even if you haven't published the book, FDA is saying that's evidence of the intended use of your product, and then looking at whether your product should be treated as a drug. And they often do take that perspective, that this sort of melding of this information is commercial speech versus First Amendment speech. So it's something that we do try to address squarely with our clients. And the one thing that is difficult to conceptualize is because obviously FTC is demanding that we have substantiation. So obviously we want to talk about the substantiation, and the FDA also anticipates that we have substantiation. So how do you sort of marry these two competing legal concepts without crossing the line and without, making sure that your risk is managed is not always easy. Next slide, please. And in 1998, as I indicated, the DSHEA disclaimer at the time, so you have to sort of rewind. And for those of you who are not as old as I am, like Richard sitting here, it's very fun to just sort of think back on how, the DSHEA disclaimer seems to sort of be like this get out of jail free card. And the FTC, even in 1998, was like, oh no, we don't believe that the DSHEA disclaimer will cure an otherwise deceptive claim. And I think that it's very interesting that FDA put the DSHEA disclaimer out there so that people wouldn't think that these structure function claims that were proliferating in the marketplace after the passage of DSHEA itself, that they hadn't put their stamp of approval on them. And, but I think the industry felt as if that means that they didn't need to have substantiation, or the claims could be whatever they needed to be. And I think that the FTC was very clear that, if you have an advertisement for herbal supplement that includes, strong and qualifying claims that the product will effectively treat diabetes or heart disease or other types of disease, that if you don't have adequate substantiation, the state, even with the shade disclaimer being prominently featured, that is not a curative. That you need evidence, and you should only make claims that are appropriate for the product category.
So now we're going to get to the 2022 guidance after all that preface and prequel. So we go to the next slide, Richard, please. So we've covered a little bit of this before, but worth covering again. The new guidance covers any health-related product, not just dietary supplements, foods, drugs, devices, supplements, anything else you can think of that is a health-related product or service. The guidance covers a broader swath of claims, structure function claims, health claims, drug claims. I mean, as you'll see when we start talking about substantiation, the FTC is moving to the view that almost drug-like substantiation, FDA level substantiation for prescription drug is really what's required on a lot of these claims. Obviously, all these issues provoke a ton of issues for people who are being sued by the FTC to try and litigate. The guidance updated several things. The substantiation standard is tightened. There's an interesting discussion of the adequacy of clinical studies and the interpretation of results, especially post hoc, what the FTC calls p-hacking. As soon as I start talking about p-values, I'm on the outside of my expertise on statistics, which is why I always call in Claudia. Continued guidance on consumer testimonials and expert endorsements, clear disclosures of material connections. That's consistent with what's in the endorsement and testimonial guidelines. And as you're thinking about this guidance, I think it's important to look at it in sort of the whole picture of what's going on at the FTC. They're also reviewing the .com disclosures, and I'll talk about some issues that are implicated there. But the .com disclosures are the FTC's guidance on how disclosures and claims ought to be presented in online advertising, which today is the vast majority of advertising. And the endorsement and testimonial guides are also reconsidering. So there's some issues there. And the new guidance, the 2022 FTC health guidance, also revises sort of the standards for how you can properly disclose things and the import or lack of qualifying terms. But on all of this, I think what you're seeing is the FTC getting tougher and tougher on advertising and being less concerned about the collateral effects of their enhanced regulatory effort, or concerned about over-enforcement chilling legitimate conduct. Nina Khan, who's the chair of the FTC, was interviewed not too long after her taking the chair, and she was asked if what things worried her, and she gave an answer that all dealt with under-enforcement. And the interviewer asked her, well, what about sort of the bad effects of over-enforcement? She goes, I don't worry about that. And then if you look at the FTC strategic plan for years, the FTC, in sort of stating its mission, talked about the need for vigorous enforcement while not chilling or not harming legitimate conduct. And that last phrase, that last caveat, was stripped from the strategic plan. And well, it's a strategic plan, it's not a law. It really does provide tremendous insight into the thought process and the balancing, perhaps the lack of balancing that occurs at the FTC these days. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, one back. There we go. Oh, yeah, substantiation standard. So, probably good to remind us, the law is the Pfizer factors, which is, the level of substantiation required for a product is determined by several factors. 1, the type of product. 2, the type of claim. 3, the benefit of truthful advertising and the cost and the feasibility of substantiating that claim, the consequences of a false claim, and the amount of substantiation experts in the field believe is reasonable. And that's a very sort of flexible case-by-case standard. And the FTC, I think, is gradually moving away from that flexible approach to a more rigid approach and trying to require in more and more circumstances, not just health claims, but earnings claims, other types of claims, essentially competent and reliable scientific evidence. As the slide notes, the substantiation standard is now rigorous, not flexible. And the prior guidance mentioned, concerns that consumers have access to information about emerging areas of science, new products, and the consumers get to choose whether, okay, this is a new product. Maybe it's not as fully tested as other products, but it's something I'm willing to consider. And the FTC, in sort of very paternalistic way, is sort of moving away from that. Generally, substantiation of health, the guidance. Generally, the substantiation of health-related benefits will need to be in the form of randomized, controlled clinical testing to meet competent, reliable scientific standards. That's getting closer and closer to what you need at the FDA for a drug. And they're really relying more and more on what experts in the field require. So if you're talking about heart benefits, you've got to have the kind of standards that a cardiologist would find are adequate. So let's go to the next slide. So again, historically it was a wider range of science and more flexible ad hoc basis. Again, moving now more and more towards a standardized, rigid standard. Courts have found that double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled studies are not explicitly required. So if you have a good expert who can explain to a court, FTC may not listen, but to a court why your science is adequate, even though it's not double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, you may be in good shape there if you're willing to go the distance and fight it out in court. Excuse me. Okay. The Bayer case in New Jersey a couple of years ago was an effort by the FTC to hold Bayer in contempt, and the issue was whether Bayer had adequate substantiation for claims it was making. And the court found for Bayer, it found that first off, consumers weren't being harmed, and that the level of substantiation was suitable for the claim, even though it didn't meet the rigid standards that the FTC was seeking to impose there, and the science and the testing had been performed on a product that was different than the product that was being sold. The court found that the experts had explained why it was proper to extrapolate from the testing to the claim, and that's really often a big area because as you move to different formulations, different dosages, it becomes really expensive to have to do a new random controlled study each time. So having good science that can back up your extrapolation from one study to a slightly different formulation, it can become really, really important. But that's got to be done before you go to market, not after. Next. And I think Claudia is taking this slide.
Yes, I am. So the adequacy and quality of clinical studies is something that we talk a lot about, and we sort of internally evaluate and, what does it mean? And so I think that we're all on the same page that, if you're making a claim that really needs a, randomized, controlled clinical study, that you need a control group, it needs to be randomized, it needs to be double blind, statistically significant results, and clinically meaningful results. And so I want to pause on that point for a moment, because I think that many of us in the industry really focus on statistically significant results. And I think that goes a long way in supporting a claim. But the FTC in these meetings, and Lynn and I have been in many of them for hours, we've been able to say, hey, this is statistically significant in all these different endpoints. And the FTC is like, well, unless the consumer had a magnifying glass or a microscope, they didn't understand that they were achieving the benefit. So the next question the FTC is asking is whether it's clinically meaningful. And I think that one of the problems that I have with that is, depending on what the claim is, obviously, is that, consumers are not always, when you're buying a cosmetic or you're looking for some immune support, I don't know that we're always going to get to clinically meaningful in terms of where consumers can discern that there's a difference between, yesterday and 10 days from the time you start using the product. And so I just think that this sort of overreach and demand in this area sometimes can be unreasonable. And so I think that, but everyone should be prepared. These are the types of questions that the FTC can and does ask. And the other thing that we haven't talked about, that we certainly will focus on it, my overall worry about this guidance document as a totality is that, the FTC is very busy with lots and lots of things. They do have, cases in the dietary supplement, food, cosmetic, and device space, but it's usually with, the cast and categories of products that no one would be surprised by. But what I think that the adequacy and quality of clinical studies sort of outlines to me is a roadmap where the plaintiff's bar, which is just as active as the FDA and the FTC, is like, well, we're not going to settle because you haven't met this particular standard of scientific evidence. And I think that that's the part that Lynn was getting to in terms of, this collateral damage that might be sort of incidental to FTC's good mission, but is causing a lot of what I consider to be good actors to be under scrutiny that they wouldn't necessarily have been before. In addition to what the FTC is expecting in terms of what that good scientific, competent scientific reliance evidence looks like, is that it should include other possible factors of clinically meaningful results, including clarity of the protocols, or a good written protocol is something that's necessary. We often recommend that you get a second opinion on the protocol before you move forward with these scientific studies. They're usually expensive and includes lots of recruiting time. Sometimes, depending on the type of studies, you might submit the protocol to an IRB to make sure that there's safety factors involved. The IRB is not one to say whether the clinical study is valid or done properly. It's just making sure that it's done safely. Depending on what the study is for, you might have to register it in a public database. All of these factors sort of lend itself to more reliability in the minds of the FTC. Duration of the study. So when we're talking about brain health, heart health, diabetes type claims, that longevity, or how long the study is something that the FTC is looking at. FTC is very skeptical of a heart health study that's only 30 days. And so those are one of the factors. Dropout rates, having a good explanation of why people drop out of studies, non-compliance. This dose-response relationship is very important to the FTC. But again, in my mind, that dose-response relationship is getting terribly close to the new drug application. And so the other thing is the language that we use. A lot of this really does get to, if you're explicitly stating that it's clinically studied or tested or evaluated, then the higher your scientific burden. So saying that you have a clinically tested ingredient implies not just that the ingredient was tested, but also that the test results prove a benefit. And I think that on its face, the ingredient itself can actually be tested, but the FTC is saying that that's not how consumers interpret that particular claim, that they're also tying that to whatever your health benefit might be. So if you're saying vitamin C supports immune health, and you then say clinically tested vitamin C, now all of a sudden the FTC is saying that your immune support claim needs to be backed by the competent and reliable scientific evidence. And so it comes full circle. So the language is very important. And as I've said already, it just really raises the bar of what FTC is expecting. So our next slide gives you a good example of where FTC has outlined what types of data that it's looking for. So here we have a marketer of an at-home brain stimulation device, and it's conducted a randomized controlled double placebo blind study of the effects on subjects with depression. The study is using validated measures to assess the impact of the device on symptoms of depressions. The subjects show statistically greater improvement in the treatment group compared to the control group in only one of the 8 measures evaluated. The other 7 measures show no real difference or separation between placebo and the treatment group. And the study, unfortunately, doesn't provide any corrective statistical correction for the multiple tests. So the FTC is expecting that all 8 measures would provide some statistical significance, or at least trending towards that. And so the fact that only one outcome out of a total of 8 showed statistically significant could be the result of chance, is the FTC's position. And so FTC would say this would be some of that p-hacking that Glenn mentioned. It could be cherry picking, as how I refer to it. And so these are some of the reasons why FTC is saying, really be mindful of, whether you have good evidence. And so specifically, they warn against the practice of selecting individual significant results or post hoc analysis. And for them, post hoc analysis is the one that departs from the original study protocol, can really be an indication in their minds, at least, that we're mining for good results in order to convey something positive about the products. And I can tell you, having, worked with Lynn, and he knows, and we work with lots of experts, that, post hoc analysis to pressure test that statistical significance is something that is routinely done. And I hope that the agency is not suggesting that we can't do any type of sort of pressure testing of the analysis in some form or fashion. But one thing I can say is that the way that the FTC has posed it, and Lynn, I'm curious about your position on this, is that I'm really worried about private litigators in courts and whether this can encourage challenges to reliance on otherwise good data, and makes that expensive scientific study less reliable or useful or valuable than it otherwise would be.
No, I mean, you're seeing, the plaintiff's bar is relentless and voracious. And so the good news is the law still remains that they can't sue for a lack of substantiation, but they certainly can sue on establishment claims. And they take a very, very broad view of what constitutes an establishment claim. So if you spent the money for a study and there's some flaw in it, or somebody thinks there's a flaw in it, whether it's a flaw in the study or the flaw in the way the data was interpreted, the plaintiff's bar is going to be right there, and they'll be right there either before or after the FTC. So I do share Claudia's concern, and where you see a lot of these post hoc analysis, and where you see a lot of history using a lot of concern by the FTC, are on products dealing with cognitive function, memory. I mean, look, we're all getting older. Some of us, like me and Claudia, are getting a lot older, but she looks better though. But part of the issue there is that even for prescription drugs, the measures of improvement are small, but but they can be meaningful. They can be clinically meaningful. But if you're looking at 20 questions that somebody's answering, the difference may be from 13 to 15 or 14 to 15 getting that answer right, or recalling those things. That's true for again, prescription medication. You see that slight improvement. So trying to figure out where to draw the line on that kind of data analysis, sometimes wonder, is this really what the FTC ought to be doing? I mean, look, if you're making claims that the product will stave off Alzheimer's, then that's different. But if you're saying, it can help you get through your day a little bit more efficiently because you're more focused, you have better concentration, you have better short-term working memory, and you feel like you do, should the FTC really be second guessing that? So anyhow,
I think
we
that's a
digress
good
little
point.
there.
I think that's a good point, Lynn, and I think that is one that we talked about before in terms of, even FDA when approving drugs, it's not a linear thing. So a lot of FDA's analysis is a risk-benefit analysis that goes into approving drugs. And I think that when you're talking about something less than a product that requires FDA approval, that risk-benefit analysis should be the risk should be really evaluated, more weighted in terms of the value. And I think that the other piece that makes me concerned about this is that we're moving closer and closer to a drug standard, despite the fact that consumers are getting more and more sophisticated and discerning about the products that they have. I think that, when the FTC felt like everyone was going into this being deceived and being misled, the market was sort of the Wild Wild West. And now consumers are like, you know what, you promised it was going to help me with grow my hair. My hair hasn't grown. I'm moving on to the next product. So no one is really being harmed, and people are not expecting to become Rapunzel when they buy these products either.
Yeah, it's really interesting with cognitive products because I think there's a strong argument that people know whether it helps.
Right. Yes.
Right. I mean, there's certain things you might not be able to assess, but you feel like you're less forgetful and you feel like you're able to focus more. The FCC says that's just placebo effect. And, we could spend a whole hour talking about that, but it seems to me that that's a improvement that a consumer ought to be able to assess, and if it doesn't work for them, then try it. I mean, there's lots of times doctors prescribe medicine for you and it doesn't work. And I just remembered I can get to play Groucho Marx here and say the secret word. The CLE code is Health 2023. That's Health 2023 for those of you who need CLE. I guess we could go to the next slide.
And I think that we can skip this slide and just go to a slide that I think you're going to cover, Lynn. I think that, the quality of science is something that we can talk about more. But these pieces, I think, is very important.
Yeah. So, it's funny. One of the terms that the Supreme Court uses sometimes is, Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes. But if you look at this, when I read the guidance document, the thing that jumped out to me as the most important was this statement here that in social media formats, hyperlinks are no longer considered unavoidable by the FTC. Now, as I mentioned, they're redoing the .com disclosures, and I have to assume this is foreshadowing for the change there. But this is a big change in, when you're making health claims, and there's all these things they want you to explain and disclaim. And if you can't use a hyperlink, it's really going to be challenging to comply. And, the FTC is responsible. Well, then, you shouldn't make claims that have to be disclosed or disclaimed. But it's easy for them to say. They're not trying to sell product, and they're not dealing in a competitive marketplace. And a lot of times the information that's there are things that consumers do want to know. So this is a big change. For here, it's in social media, but I suspect it will work its way into other forms of online advertising as well. So stay tuned. But this is a big change. And again, they always fall back on net impression, but I'm not sure the FTC has ever found a disclosure changes the net impression, even though sometimes confronted with survey evidence, they still don't find that. So stay tuned. We should keep going. We're chewing up time here. Next slide. Okay, yeah. So this is more the same. That when you're dealing with complex scientific claims, you have to make it clear to the consumers that things are uncertain or limited. One of the things I think that Claudia and I were both concerned about was the qualifying this FTC statement, the qualifying modifiers, such as promising for studies, preliminary, initial, or pilot, or that a product may provide a benefit. consumers understand the difference between promising and concrete. They understand may isn't will. The FTC is not so sure about that, and really is drawing a pretty hard line on these kinds of modifiers. The results not typical. The FTC no longer finds that sufficient. You've also got to say what is typical, and that's probably most common in weight loss. So if you've got some outliers, people who lost a lot of weight on a program or a medication, you've got to also track what the typical result was. Claudia, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add on this, and it was one we were both talking about.
Yes, I think that I really do question whether the FTC is going too far with respect to the modifier of these types of terms. I think that, maybe promising is too positive, but preliminary, initial, and pilot, I think that these are all language that we understand. This is, whatever I'm going to say next is not the final word on it. And I go to the idea that FDA, who's sort of the primary jurisdiction of these types of products, uses type of language to talk about what type of additional scientific information is necessary. And I also feel like it's very paternalistic that consumers don't understand that we're at the beginning of this. And so you can make a choice as to whether you want to take the product or not. And I also go back to this risk-benefit analysis in this particular category that, we're not causing people to avoid going to their doctors. These are, in most times, what I consider to be just sort of products that we all want to make sure that we're taking the best care of our health and in our children's health and things like that, that it's really proactive. We're not looking for treatments. And so I really do feel like this type of language not only has a potential to go too far, but it really has a chilling effect on the way that you can communicate the scientific evidence. And I really do say the agencies cannot have it both ways. You cannot ask us to have evidence and then decide that we have some evidence, we say what the some evidence is or the preliminary nature of it, and then you say that doesn't go far enough. I just think that that's not fair.
It's also interesting, I don't want to get into macro political issues, but at the same time that there's all this criticism of drug companies being too big and having too much power and making too much money, if you're this kind of substantiation standard makes it very hard for anybody except a big drug company to develop anything, because the amount of R&D that's necessary to do preliminary tests and see if things show promise. A lot of companies need some revenue to come in to offset those costs. So, as a society, I think, you got to think about where you draw these lines, because they do have macroeconomic consequences and they do impact, who can develop therapy. We should probably go to the next slide.
Because we're running out of time, Lynn. I think
we are.
You want to do it?
So, go ahead, Claudia.
So I think that I do want to spend our last minutes on this, because I think this is something that we're all confronted with, this third-party literature and two-click rule. And I think I sort of mentioned this at the beginning of the seminar. The FTC doesn't buy into two-click rule, and very quickly is that this idea that Lynn was talking about in terms of sort of separation of church and state, if you will. If you're talking about the scientific evidence that there's no link or way to get back to your commercial enterprise on the internet, so there would be essentially two websites housed on the same host, but there wouldn't be any interconnectivity between the two. FTC is like, no, we don't think that that's right. That, there's not necessarily enough distance between, the implicating claims from the products being sold. And so claims implied by directly or indirectly referencing third-party literature will not prevent FTC from holding the marketing accountable for the substantiating the implied claim. So the FTC is taking the position that this two-click rule doesn't protect you from being responsible for information that might be on your educational site versus on your actual site. And so FTC saying this so loudly and clearly raises not only FTC implications, but also private litigator implications. And so something to be mindful of and to reevaluate in light of this.
I'm just going to note the irony that they're, imposing this 2-click rule, but they don't think that having a disclaimer 1 click away is sufficient. And that juxtaposition is interesting.
It is very interesting. It's very interesting. And I think that we're at the end of the time, and I know that the window will close. And I just wanted to let you know that we're happy to answer questions. Our team is going to be at Expo West, answering questions. We're available. Lynn is always available. And we're happy to circulate the slides. And I know that our marketing team will be circulating the slides at the conclusion of this today.
And for those of you who posed questions, we'll try to get back to you to answer them. I'm sorry. We thought we left enough time, but there's a lot to chew on here. And once again, remember the CLE code for those of you that need it is Health 2023. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.